Thanks, Eva. Can everyone hear me fine? Awesome. All right, thank you for that introduction. Just a quick recap. Right, so I am a software engineering senior lecturer at the University of Auckland. Basically what that means is I'm an academic as well as a researcher, so I teach and research, and much of that is in Agile. I've got a PhD in Agile. You can actually do that. My topic was self-organizing Agile teams, right? And I also founded the Agile course at the University of Auckland, which is a final year course for the Bachelor of Engineering, Software Engineering students. It's also taken up by some of the master's students, and the idea is to have industry propose projects that students work on, and they apply Agile after going through some of the theory for a few weeks at the beginning. So this has been running for 5 years now, and we've got some really great sponsors who work with us and propose these projects, and the students work on them and get to practice Agile, not just learn the theory of Agile. The other thing is, of course, the research that I do isn't really research that sits in the labs. It's not stuff that's only in the books. I actually go out into the industry and look at how people practice Agile and talk to them about their problems, their experiences, things that work, things that don't work, and that's what forms the basis of what I write about in my research. Which then, of course, has led to a number of publications on Agile topics. Most of these are available free on my website, so feel free to grab those. A lot of times, practitioners may think that these are not freely available, but in fact they are. And a lot of researchers around the world are moving towards the model where they make these freely available. I mean, what's research if practitioners don't get to use it, right? All right, so which brings me to the topic of today, which is the theory of becoming agile. And while I was preparing for this talk, my older son, and he asked, Mom, what are you going to get out of this? Are you going to get a new project? Is it going to be an assignment? What are you going to make of this? And that made me think, like, why am I doing this, right? And so the answer I got back in my head was, this is my time to give back to the community, which feeds my research, right? So this is closing the loop and giving back the research experiences that I've learned from many of you here, possibly participants of my research, right? And I think researchers can use that opportunity more often, not just to present in research-based conferences, but also at practitioner conferences. So hopefully you find this useful. And in case you're wondering what that award-winning bit is, so I was fortunate to receive the Distinguished Paper Award at the International Conference on Software Engineering earlier this year, which means what you're about to hear is one of 6 best papers in software engineering in the world today. I don't want to hype it up too much. It's got to live up to the expectations. So we're diving straight into it. Looking at the state of Agile, right? This is the state of the Agile survey. We've got 96% of the participants saying we're doing Agile in some way, shape, or form, right? Now that's not too surprising, but what is surprising for me is the next bit, which is 80% are saying we're still maturing. So it kind of, makes you think about what's really going on. And what's really going on is that people are facing heaps of challenges, right? Heaps of challenges in adopting Agile. And so there was this really useful and comprehensive literature review performed by Lopez Martinez, 2016, that sort of tried to categorize all of these problems people have been having. And the 4 themes that they found that this fit into most commonly was people. So people-related problems, organization-related problems, culture fits into this, project-related problems, so size, for example, fits into that, and process-related problems, all right? These are links to all of the papers that talk about these research studies and those specific problems, right? So if you were interested, you could go up and look these up in Google Scholar. Typically, you would go something like Agile, people, problem, and the name of the author. As I said before, hopefully you'll find that it's freely available. Most authors try and do that these days. The next bit was that there were certain areas that were particularly challenging when it came to Agile adoption, and this was categorized as initial problems that people had. Some other studies focused on failed adoption sort of efforts, and finally there were also papers that looked at what are the problems people are having on practicing Agile on a regular basis. So again, that's information if you wanted to follow up. Now, as well as that, researchers have also looked at what's working. So not just what the challenges are, but try to propose solutions in terms of frameworks that can help practitioners overcome their challenges associated with adoption. So these are some of the models that I could find, and that's again based on a comprehensive literature review study by Ronan et al. 2010. So arguably a bit slightly outdated, but definitely covers some of the really major ones. So Sidki, for example, I'm not sure he's here now, Ahmed, but his model on Agile maturity, Agile adoption improvement model, Agile adoption solution framework, distributed Agile transition model, all of these attempts incrementally to try and help people make sense of this journey, right? So those are all of your authors. The other kind of view, which is not model-based, is the sort of looking at it from a process perspective, right? So the process theory of agility. How does it, work as a process? So there's Wolfe and Ralph, 2016, and then the Agile Transformation Framework. These are, again, two that are interesting and pretty useful. Right, now, having done this, all right, I do have an example to show. So this is an example of what one of these models look like. So if you kind of walk through it, you will see on your left the fact that you've got different levels going on, and they've got names such as the Agile Prompt, the Agile Crux, the apex of getting on with that journey, and it's associated with a number of different stages, right? So level 1, you might be focusing on speed and flexibility. Level 2, you kind of start to really become communication-oriented and things like that, right? So this is an example of some of the models that have been proposed. So this isn't mine. One of the ones that I reviewed as part of the literature that I saw. All right, so the current understanding, this is what I went away with after having finished the review, is that Agile adoption is really being looked at as a one-off event, okay? It's being looked at as something that has to come in predefined stages, right? As we just saw in that model, right? So you've got level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4 going on. And almost always there's, at least at a time, a single dimensional focus on, you've got either really high level abstract values, so you're looking at things like speed and flexibility, or you start really in the trenches with the low level practices such as pair programming and test-driven development, right? And what that means for the average practitioner is that really they don't know where to start. Do you start with the low-level technical practices? Do you try and attain those high-level abstract values? Where do we begin, and how do we reconcile this huge gap, right? So that left a whole lot of unanswered questions, and researchers, we like those unanswered questions, right? Because that's what drives us. So one of those were, why is it that some teams are more agile than others, right? How can we explain the differences? What are the aspects that are affected during agile transitions, and how do they relate to each other? Right? So all of these interesting questions are there, and that kind of led me to look at this particular research project, which uses a method called grounded theory. So I'd probably bet not more than probably nobody other than Siva in the audience had probably heard of grounded theory. Has anyone ever heard of grounded theory? You have? Oh my goodness. Glad to be proven wrong. Thanks for that. Brilliant. But for everybody else, grounded theory really, in a nutshell, is a method that is used to look at social interactions in particular, look at human beings and people and how they interact. And that makes it particularly suited to study agile problems, because guess what? People are at the center of the agile methodologies, right? So the other thing that's interesting about grounded theory is the fact that we don't start with a hypothesis. So it's not like I say, oh, I think it's going to be this, and then try and see if it's right or wrong. It's in fact completely the other way around, which is I go in with no preconceived notions, just a few questions, ask the people, right, the practitioners, the participants, and then try to build the theory from bottom up by looking at the common patterns across the entire participant base. All right, so very, very different. I didn't know what the answers were starting off. All right, so this particular one is based on 31 Agile practitioners. However, I would argue that my own understanding, of course, has been informed by hundreds, possibly, of Agile practitioners that I've talked to over the years. So spread across 5 countries, and this kind of involved about an hour of semi-structured interviews and some observations on site. Now, to get a diverse perspective, I would talk to people who are in different roles: developers, testers, scrum masters, project managers, BAs, and so forth. Their total experience varied from as little as 2 years in the industry to 14 years, and their Agile experience varied from as little as 4 months of starting to do Agile to as much as 6 years. And the methods that they were using, unsurprisingly, were Scrum, Kanban, Lean, and mixed methods, right? All right, so on to the theory. So this is cut to the chase in terms of all of the data analysis, a lot of pains and angst to get to what all of this really means. So you get to listen to the final results, which is that I identified 5 different dimensions across which Agile transitions happen, all right? So these are transitioning software development practices, no surprise there, right? It's kind of coming from the software arena, so you would expect that. But then also team practices, right? Management approach, reflective practice, and finally, culture, right? So at this point, you might be going, that doesn't make sense, or I knew that, or from practice and from experience, that sounds about right. So I should say at this point, this doesn't mean these are the only dimensions of becoming Agile. However, these are the ones that rose up to the top from that process as being the most important to the people that I talk to, okay? So if your experiences are different, by all means, come and talk to me afterwards. I would love to discuss that. But for now, these are the dimensions that I'm talking about. And the other thing that is important is, if again, this reflects the experiences you've had in the past, then this is a great way of sort of going back to whatever presentations or conversations that you have, and you can say, research says, right? And that's why I'm here, to help you say that. All right, so we start off with the first dimension, which is transitioning software development practices. And this includes things like the delivery model. All right, so are you delivering in a sequential manner or iterative and incremental manner? Are your meetings including things like sprint and release planning, daily stand-ups, demos? Or are you using the artifacts, which are Scrum boards or product and release backlogs and user stories and things like that? Okay, now I'm going to, along with the transitioning, I will bring in actual quotes from participants so that you can get a feel for the sort of things that I heard, and you get a taste for what people were talking to me about. So the first one here is traditional, and what that means is these are people who were new to Agile and teams where Agile was just being kind of introduced. So you've got a person in India, one of my participants, saying people are resistant to the changes, right? Not everybody is willing to go on to the meetings very often, right? But over time, it gets easier. So you can start to see that they may have started off rather traditional, okay? And then there were some other teams that were kind of hybrid. Okay, so they're saying transition happens over time. It happens slowly. First off, they may not understand the sprint planning. They may not understand why we need to go to these meetings. You can explain to them, and then they initially start off learning and then start to apply. So here is an example of a team that was in a hybrid kind of state when it came to the software development practices, right? So they are slowly transitioning into it. And then finally, I would have seen teams that were truly sort of agile, but on the software development dimension. Remember, because there are the 4 other dimensions as well. So this was marked by consistent use of Agile practices and the artifacts that I mentioned before. So you would actually be going to meetings as very much part of everyday practice, and you don't have to think twice about using the artifacts and using those practices. So it's really become embedded for the team. So that's the software development dimension. Moving on to the next one, which is the team practices, and this is classified as things such as project management. And that's interesting because traditionally teams aren't meant to do a lot of project management, but guess what? Agile teams do, all right? So, and also task management, which I put separately because I found that self-assignment in particular was actually really a hallmark feature of self-organizing teams. So again, what are the sort of steps of this dimension? The first, which is the teams that are new on this dimension or are low on this dimension, start off being manager-driven. Okay, so there's an example of a project manager saying, we really don't feel delegated tasks. We actually feel this is one job less. So that's an example of a team where they are getting delegated, but they're actually comfortable with it. They are fine with where they are, right? And that is because they're pretty much manager-driven, okay? And that's how they are on that dimension. They may actually be quite high or advanced on the software dimension, but this is what the team practices are looking like. Next up, manager-assisted. So you move on from being manager-driven to becoming manager-assisted. And you've got an example of a developer here in India saying, oh, we get assistance from the manager on how to, from the Scrum Master on how to assign tasks. But in the future, we'd be looking to do this ourselves, right? So what that's telling you is not only do they know where they're at, which is they are getting help right now, but they also have a vision for where they need to be in the future, which is they need to ultimately be self-organizing and pick up tasks on their own. So that's the state where you're kind of manager-assisted, somewhere in the middle. And then finally, if you're further along on that dimension, we've got examples of teams that were truly team-driven, not manager-driven, not so much assisted, but really team-driven. And this is, so you've got quotes like the Scrum Master in New Zealand saying almost all the tasks are exclusively self-assigned, right? And another example is a senior developer in India saying, we really don't wait for the team leads. We directly contact our clients and get stuff sorted. So the project management side of things is sort of coming into the hands of the team more so than managers. Right, so that's the transition that happens on the team practices side of things. Two sides of the same coin. You cannot talk about management, talk about team practices without talking about the management approach. All right? So the management approach must also transition if you are going to transition to Agile. And this includes things like customer collaboration, where as a manager, are you stepping up very quickly to intervene or mediate the interaction between the team and the customers, or are you letting your team do it themselves? Similarly, for the problem-solving side of things, are you doing it on behalf of the team, or are you letting them do it themselves? So initially, a lot of the teams from the management approach were being driven by the managers. So the management approach was a driving approach. They're driving the team. Here's an example of a software engineer in India saying, our manager very much is the first point of contact, right? Next up, you've got a stage where you the management approach is adapting. So by managers here, I mean people who are in some kind of a management/leadership role, where be it a Scrum Master or a product, not a product owner, that's really customers, Scrum Masters or project managers or product managers or whatever the title may be, but they somehow feel responsible for the team in different capacities. Right? So this is an example of project manager in New Zealand saying, the self-organization right now in my team is 50-50, right? So they're very aware of the fact that it's transitioning, and they are also transitioning their approach in response to that. So I need to actively monitor the activities right now so that they don't revert to old ways of working, but ultimately you want to lead them to the next bit, which is your management approach should completely move on to becoming empowering, right? So, and I saw examples of this. For example, the Scrum Master in New Zealand saying, for me, the self-organizing team is something that wouldn't notice if I disappeared. And they laugh about it. But then there's another angle to it, which is by the senior developer in Australia, and they're saying, Well, it's not as if, you don't need any stinking managers. You do need people to step in sometimes and need someone who cuts the interferences from the outside. So conflict resolution and things like that seem to be the place for managers to step in. Next one, reflective practices. So you're looking at, and we just the talk right before, we talked about learning and always continuously learning, so that's definitely one of the key aspects. So you're looking at things which are very standard, such as retrospectives, but also sort of informal learning sessions or maybe even formal training sessions organized by the company. And the idea behind inspect and adapt always. So for the teams that were new or low on the reflective practices dimension, right, I saw that they were limited in their reflective practices, all right? And what this means is something like, if the whole team is lacking information or knowledge in a particular area, then you would organize a training, and that's all fine. But the problem was that the entire team saw it as time away from implementation. They saw it as a bit of a burden. Oh, we have to do this. Only if we can kind of get through this, we can get back to work, right? So it's that critical distinction between not just having learning availability, but actually being willing and looking forward to it. Next up was when teams became a little bit more focused about their reflective practices, which is to say, all right, we're going to focus on one practice at a time, for example, and see how we improve on that. So here's an example of a team that introduced planning poker, and they were actively tracking how they were doing on that one particular practice. So they were quite focused on their reflective practice. But the teams that were the furthest along on the reflective practices dimension were the teams where the learning became embedded. It was part of their DNA. They didn't question this. It wasn't time off of implementation. It was very much part of the everyday work. And again, it goes back to the talk right before me, talking about bringing the learning inside the sprints and inside the iterations. So that was reflective practices. Moving on to culture. All important, very important culture. Now, this was a little bit tricky for me to try and wrap my head around this. I felt a really strong sort of feeling that this is not just organizational culture, all right? This is not just national culture. This is not just work culture. It's an amalgamation of a whole lot of things. And the way I'm defining culture here is a combination of individual culture. You could, aspects of your personality count, your background, your experiences, what you prefer, what you don't. That counts, right? Who am I as an individual? Your culture, your team has a culture, right? That might be separate from your own. So the sum of the parts becomes larger than each part. And then finally, the organizational culture. So it's really a combination of the individual, the team, and the organization that forms this cultural angle or dimension. And so individuals and teams within the same organization will manifest different levels of autonomy because of this factor, right? Because individuals vary in their level of autonomy, teams vary in their level of autonomy, and the organization or as a whole may or may not be, they may be low on their how much autonomy they give to their teams, or they may be high. But what the individuals and teams make of that autonomy is also different, right? So that's why you see different manifestations. So here, obviously, the one which is the lowest was the hierarchical culture. And so you've got a development in India saying, we need to have approvals from the managers. You've got to talk to the product owner, who then talks to the client, who then... So you can clearly see there is such a clearly defined sense of hierarchy when it comes to communication lines. And that was sort of, for me, a sign that this is rather hierarchical at the moment, the culture. The next one is evolving. So again, you're in that transitioning sort of phase. So you've got the senior development in the US saying, we do not have a defined communications hierarchy, right? So we're kind of moving there, we're getting there. And the ones where it was really open, the culture, at an individual level, at a team level, and at the organizational level, is where the individuals are free to do stuff, but they also take up that freedom. So it's sort of a two-way process. You can empower people, but if they're not ready to be empowered, it's not going to work, right? So it's a combination of the individuals taking on that empowerment that was provided by the environment. Okay. Cool. All right, so we move on to putting these different pieces together, right? So I was at this point, I was at the sort of point where I had these 5 dimensions, and I had to do another level of analysis to find what is the relationship between these dimensions, right? So that's what a grounded theory is, that it describes the relationships between the different categories. So what are our categories? These are the software development practices, the team practices, management approach, the reflective practice, and culture, right? And now we're moving to a set of interrelated hypotheses, okay? So lo and behold, the theory of becoming agile. Right, so here's how it works. The first hypothesis, remember I didn't start off with a hypothesis, I ended up with hypotheses, okay? So this is the first one. Transition in the software development practices is necessary, although not sufficient, for changes in team practices and management approach. And at this point, you're saying, Rashina, all right, that's the academic in you. You got to bring this down. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to break it down. What basically that means is it's most likely that teams will start off by changing their software development practices first. And then you start to see the transition in the team practices and the management approach happen. Is it sequential? No. It's probably going somewhere in parallel, but the kickoff point is the decision someone took or the team took that, all right, we're going to try this thing called Agile, and it inevitably starts with the software development practices changing. Is that making sense? All right? So when you say not, or when I say not sufficient, what that means is that's not the only thing that's going to help the team practices change and the management approach change, but it's definitely necessary to get that ball rolling. Okay? Next one, and this is possibly my favorite, which is the transition in the team practices and the management approach tend to reflect and adapt to each other. So remember, with the team practices, you had the team going from being manager-driven to manager-assisted to team-driven, right? And the idea for the management approach is to go from being driving to empowering. Now, this is almost like a dance in some ways. If you've got a team that is hell-bent on being manager-driven, they really are not ready to take on the autonomy. The manager, on the other hand, is wanting to become empowering, right? And they're trying to give that autonomy. It's not going to work until they reflect off of each other and move in the same direction, right? The effort has to be from both sides. It's not just the team, not just the managers, but both in tandem, right? So that's what this means. Now, I did an early bit of piece of my research from 2010, talked about the self-organizing roles in Agile, which is what are the roles people play on teams. And interestingly enough, now looking at it sort of, 7 years down the line, it fits into this theory because it is the roles that people play on those teams is almost the handoff process of that autonomy from the managers to the team. Now, I don't have time today to go into the roles. That's another talk. But again, that paper is a 2010 paper available on my website if you wanted to see what roles people played. And I'm not talking about development and testers and developers. Waterfall has that as well. Doesn't make them agile, doesn't make them self-organizing. I'm talking about the informal roles. So I'll give you a teaser, things like mentor, coordinator, champion, promoter, and my favorite, there was terminator. All right, but that's not for today. So moving on, the third hypothesis, and this is possibly going to be the one that surprises you the most, which is the transition in the team practices and the management approach are necessary but not sufficient for changes in the reflective practice. Again, breaking this down, what this basically means is reflective practices I saw were the last to mature. Okay? A lot of Agile literature recommends you've got reflective practices from day one, and that's all fine, but the moment where I saw people and teams starting to get real value from their reflective practices was when they were a lot further along on their other dimensions already. So they were really used to the Agile software development practices, they're further along in their team practices, the management approach was transitioning, and at that point, that the reflection really started to help. You're not just doing lip service, or you're not just having a retrospective for the sake of having retrospective. It's actually meaningful, and you are able to get continuous improvement from it. And finally, culture, above, over, everything, encompassing everything, is the fact that all of these transitions are going to be influenced by the culture, where, remember, I defined it as a combination of the individual, team, and the organization. Right? So all of this gets affected by culture, in that if the teams and the managers and everybody else is trying their level best to transition across all of the other 4 practices, but the organizational culture is not conducive, guess what? It's going to be really difficult. It might even bring the whole thing down. All right? So that is, in a nutshell, the theory of becoming agile. What about implications and use? How can you start to use this in your everyday lives? So here are some sort of, I look at this as a way of understanding agility, right? So I really see agility now as a complex network of transitions across multiple dimensions, right? That's what becoming agile is. It's not about changing your software development practices from waterfall to agile kind of practices. It's changing all of these other dimensions as well, right? At the same time, possibly in parallel, in some order, but it's multiple dimensions for sure. And it takes 2 to tango, which is the team and the managers must both transition towards self-organization, otherwise it's not going to happen. So here's one of the things that I did, which is I compared 2 of the teams that participated and tried to chart them on this radar chart to see how they are doing across the different dimensions, right? So you will see team 1 in blue and team 2 in green, right? Across the different software practices, team practices, management approach, reflective practices, and culture. So if you notice the first one, which is software practices, you will see that the team 1 is slightly higher. And what high means doesn't necessarily mean better or good or nice. What it basically means is, if you wanted to do agile, if that's what your thing is, then high means you are more agile in your practices and not as traditional. All right? So low would be traditional, M would be hybrid, medium would be hybrid, and high would be agile. Right? For team practices, low means you're still manager-driven, whereas high means you're probably team-driven. So here you see that the 2 teams for the team practices angle are about the same, not too different. The management approach, again, is about the same, so medium-ish. But so this is one where I saw a big difference. These are teams, 2 teams within the same organization have a different level of reflective practice. So one is medium, so they're kind of focused, but the other team was really low on their reflective practices. They're still stuck with, that training thing again, right? So they need to overcome that and make progress on that dimension, okay? And finally, the culture, the overall culture within the same organization is kind of different, again, because the team is not taking on that empowerment. So what this really means is different teams will progress on these 5 dimensions at different rates, right? And that's why, and that it kind of explains why different teams are more or less agile than others, because it's not just software development practices. It's all of these other things going on. So I suppose for researchers, obviously, it means that we can use this framework to measure agility. You can start to baseline a team when we are observing them and to see their journey. For yourselves as practitioners, it's for the teams to self-assess and to sort of help improve. So you could use this if you wanted to see where you are on these different dimensions and then chart your agile journey and see how that's progressing over time. Right, so What I'm really arguing for today is a change in perspective. We need to move away from thinking about Agile adoption as a one-off staged sort of progression across either abstract high-level values or really low-level development practices, which is doing Agile, right? To thinking about Agile as transitions which are holistic, they're complex, networks across multiple dimensions, right, which is becoming Agile. Now, I realize, interestingly, not funnily enough, but serendipitously, this has been one of the themes of the conference. So this research has been conducted over the last 2.5 years, written up last year, published earlier this year, so it was not planned, right? So it's all nice to see that it vibes in with what the industry and rest of you are talking about. So I'll sort of leave you with this idea of looking at Agile. If I was to give you one analogy, it would be this. Think about child development, right? For those who have children or know, have nephews or nieces or whatever, and you're looking at them progressing, right? So if you compared a child to another child on the basis of, the height or the weight or whatever, that's not enough, that's not proper. Why? Because that's just one dimension, it's the physical dimension of growth. Whereas what's happening with children is that they're growing on multiple dimensions: physical, social, cognitive, creative, emotional. So in order to assess, you really need to take account of all of these dimensions, and that's the same with Agile teams. It's not just one dimension on software development practices. And that's it. So yeah, hopefully we'll all get to be real people, and thank you for your time.